Henryk Mandelbaum was brought to the Nazi death camp Auschwitz-Birkenau on April 22, 1944, in another transport of Jews sentenced to death. Previously, his entire family was murdered in the very same death camp. Henryk received the number 181970 and was assigned to the Sonderkommando. Before his death, he told a Czech journalist about his experiences. Mandelbaum's testimony is a historical document, a first-hand account about the extermination of Jews. Sonderkommando consisted of young, strong men chosen from the transport by the SS men. If any of them refused, he was shot on sight. In any case, after approximately 3 months, the members of Sonderkommando were killed off and replaced with new men. New transports arrived by train every day to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The cars were crammed with people like sardines. In each transport, there were approximately 2,000 people. When the train arrived at the camp ramp, yelling SS men with dogs would divide the exhausted from the difficult journey passengers into two groups. Women, children, the elderly, and the disabled went to one side, and strong young men to the other. The first group, consisting of about 75% of the newcomers, went unknowingly straight to the gas chambers. The second group was supposed to work in German chemical plant IG Farben. Sonderkommando comforted the newcomers. They encouraged them by saying that everything was going to be all right. Every group was followed by an ambulance with a red cross on it. It was always at the tail of the column. It was a deception that was supposed to calm people down. In reality, the ambulance was carrying cans with diatomaceous earth saturated with cyanide, Zyklon B. Sonderkommando would accompany them to the place where they were reportedly supposed to bathe before being placed in camp's residential buildings. They entered subterranean bathhouses, where they undressed. People were encouraged to make a list of their possessions and to remember the numbers of their clothes hangers. Soap, towels, and toothbrushes were distributed among the people. They were told that when they finish bathing, a meal will await them. SS men even placed a plaque sign that said, "Bathe quickly until the water is warm." Sometimes the victims were accompanied by the orchestra. As the bathhouse gradually filled with more and more people, the victims, unaware of what was happening, grew more and more suspicious and started to realize that it is not possible for such a large number of people to bathe together. They wanted to get out, but the SS man would beat them, cram them inside, and lock the door. When there were even more people inside the bathhouse, they grew anxious. But it was too late. Sometimes, at the same time, there were as many as 1,000 people inside the bathhouse. They would panic and wail, but there was no escape. Instead of water, the Nazis poured approximately 6 cans of Zyklon B into the chamber. Within 20 minutes, everyone died. Many scratched prayers on the walls with their fingernails. The others groaned and screamed. After the groaning and screaming, which the SS man called the Great Rumble, there was nothing but silence in the gas chamber. Sometimes, however, the whole chamber would resound with singing. To the guards' amazement, it was Hatikva, which is now the national anthem of Israel. When the door was opened, the chamber was filled with a pile of gnarled bodies. The corpses were soiled with feces, blood, and vomit, which only shows in what horrible agony the victims died. Sonderkommando then pulled them out of the chambers. Afterwards, they cut their hair and pulled out their gold and silver teeth. They checked if there was no jewelry or anything valuable left in their ears, noses, mouths, and vaginas. The corpses were piled up and transported by the elevator to the crematorium above the bathhouse. One crematorium had 15 furnaces lined with kamet equipped with air-blowing units. The engineers of the company that built the crematorium were visiting regularly to upgrade the furnaces. The producers proudly placed their logos on them. 3 corpses and some small children were stacked on the metal stretcher. 2 people pushed them into the furnace, and the third one forced them further with a poker so that the door could be closed. In one crematorium, in 15 furnaces, in 20 minutes, 45 corpses, excluding children, were incinerated. There were 5 of those crematoria. Even when there weren't any transports, the crematoria still operated due to high mortality rate among the prisoners, diseases, executions, and exhausting roll calls. The roll calls were an everyday torture that started at 6 in the morning, regardless of the weather. The prisoners had to stand to attention for many hours. In prisoners' testimonies, the name Muslim often appears. It was used in reference to people on the verge of death. During the roll calls, the weakest ones fell to their knees and supported their heads on the ground, just like praying Muslims. They were shot, kicked to death, or left to die. The number of victims was so high that the crematoria couldn't keep up. Whenever this happened, the bodies were burned in large ditches. Those who died during the transport and those who were too weak to leave the train cars under their own steam were put on a truck that spilled them into the burning ditches, no matter if they were still alive or dead. Toward the end of the interview, the Czech journalist asked Henrik Mandelbaum, "Where was God at that time?" Henrik laughed sarcastically and said that because of what he saw in Auschwitz-Birkenau, he is not capable of believing in God. In the previous discussion about the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, I concluded, based on the Bible, that God was not responsible for that. Just like Zofia Naukowska wrote in her medallions, people brought this fate upon people. The Bible reveals the backstage of history and shows that the genocide in death camps was done by the Nazis, whose minds were possessed by the powers of darkness. Today, I am going to answer another question. If God is not responsible for the death camps and the monstrosities that happened there, why would He let them happen? The first issue that we have to discuss is the free will of every human being, the right to make decisions and choices, even those bad ones, and every nation's right to self-determination in terms of its future. God is not a tyrant, autocrat, or a dictator. His reign is not totalitarian. His authority is based on love that guarantees well-being to the world. God respects the choices of His creatures, even if they are against His will. Man created in God's image was perfect and free. He could love God, but didn't have to. He could reject His values or accept them. The choice was his. God didn't create us as mindless machines who are controlled from the top, programmed robots deprived of free will. By giving us free will, God gave us instructions on how we should make our way so that our lives were happy. He included them in the Ten Commandments. The Old Testament tells us that God declared the Decalogue on Mount Sinai. The Bible gives us some interesting details of the story. Let's look at the book of Exodus, the second book of Moses, chapter 31. In verse 18, we read, "When God had finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, He gave him the two flat stones on which He had written all His laws with His own hand." In chapter 32, let's read verses 15 and 16. "And Moses turned and went down from the mount, and the two tables of the testimony were in his hand. The tables were written on both their sides. On the one side and on the other were they written. And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, graven upon the tables." In order for us to understand how important the Decalogue is, God wrote it down personally. Was Moses, who was educated in Egypt, unable to write it down according to God's will? He knew how to write in at least two languages, Hebrew and Egyptian. God wrote down the Decalogue personally so that we understood that it comes from Him and that it is holy. If we value the Old and New Testament, which were written by the hand of a man, even though the biblical authors were under divine inspiration, then how much more seriously we should treat the Decalogue, whose commandments God did not allow any man to write down, but did it Himself. God wrote down the Decalogue on two tablets of stone. For 80-year-old Moses, carrying those two slabs down to the Israeli settlement was probably very difficult, given that he had to walk through a very difficult alpine terrain. In those times, people knew more handy writing materials. The quite durable papyrus, wax tablets, or clay tablets. God shows that the commandments is not something written in sand or in another delicate writing material. God's law was written in stone. Stone is durable, resistant to many factors. It stands the passage of time. The same is with the Decalogue. It is a timeless and unchanging law of life. God's law contains fundamental rules of proper demeanor that guarantees happiness. When God, through Moses, called upon the Israelites to accept the Decalogue, He declared that this is a matter of life and death, good and evil, and that each man has a choice. In the book of Deuteronomy, in the 5th book of Moses, in chapter 30, God addresses Israel with these words, "See, I have set before thee this day life and good, and death and evil, and that I command thee this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in His ways, and to keep His commandments, and His statutes, and His judgments, that thou mayest live and multiply. And the Lord thy God shall bless thee in the land whither thou goest to possess it. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live." In the words of the above appeal, which calls to the observance of the Decalogue, we notice another important matter. It is the universal law of causality. Or, in other words, the law of cause and effect. Everything that happens around us has its cause, and every cause triggers a certain effect. The universal law of causality is written in the free will of man and in every nation's right to self-determination. Any decision or choice a human being makes brings certain after-effects for themselves and for the environment. A mountaineer knows that gravity is relentless, but the decision is up to them. Would God be able to stop them? Of course. But does the mountaineer have to keep climbing? No, but they want to. It is their choice. They take the risk. Adrenaline is their way of getting through life. If they get killed, who is responsible? Along the roads, at the crash sites, there are crosses that say, "It was God's will." Was it really God's will that a young person was killed in a motorcycle accident? Was that person unaware that death likes to drive fast and that you can't outsmart the laws of physics? When a 45-year-old woman is dying of lung cancer from smoking, who was responsible for that? She was aware what side effects can be caused by her addiction. But it was her choice and nobody forced her to do it. If God forbade her to smoke, she would accuse him of being a tyrant. She is an adult after all, and everyone should let her live her own life. God gave us reason and divine laws written down in the Bible so that we lived by them and avoided problems. And then, on the graves of those who didn't listen to reason and broke the laws of nature, we carved that it was God's will. In 1934, after the death of President Hindenburg, Adolf Hitler assumed the title of Führer and the Chancellor of the Reich. By doing so, he possessed the plenitude of power. In 1936, elections to the Reichstag in Germany were held. 99% of voters supported Hitler. That means almost the entire nation. The body of financiers supported Hitler as his politics gave hope to step out of the crisis through militarization. They knew what militarization led to, but business was business. The entire Germany followed Hitler. Churches and religious associations, for the most part, declared loyalty to Hitler. Were Christian Germany, Catholic South and Protestant North, not aware of the Decalogue? Was God supposed to stop Hitler? He could, but then the free will of the individual and the entire nation would be just a myth. God would have to do the same for fascist Italy, Japan, and many other countries. In short, he would have to enslave the entire world. The scriptures tell us that breaking divine laws is a sin. And what does sin lead to? To pain, suffering, and death. By breaking divine laws, nations and governments led to a terrible war, and God received all the blame. God could stop this by depriving people of their free will and turning them into mindless robots who would be controlled from the top. Because wars and tragedies that are the result of ignoring the Decalogue happen all the time, God would have to destroy the entire humanity or deprive it of its free will. God let the Second World War happen not only because he respected every person's free will and every nation's right of self-determination in terms of its existence. Another reason was to show that humanity lost its ability to pursue a policy that guaranteed well-being and peace. Why humanity lost its ability to pursue a policy that guaranteed well-being and safety? Because God's commandments have been ignored. Ignoring God's law is the main source of problems. This was particularly stressed in the book of prophet Isaiah, chapter 48, verses 17 through 18. Thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am the Lord, thy God, which teacheth thee to profit, which leadeth thee by the way that thou shouldest go. O that thou hadst hearkened to my commandments! Then had thy peace been as a river, and thy righteousness as the waves of the sea. Please pay close attention to the second part. O that thou hadst hearkened to my commandments! Then had thy peace been as a river, and thy righteousness as the waves of the sea. From the ancient times, nations pursue a policy that is not in accordance with the Decalogue. Its demands are transgressed. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet what is not yours, and love your neighbor as yourself. It is no surprise, then, that we have been suffering for generations. The events that precede the Second World War show that we are not able to guarantee lasting peace and happiness. The cause of it is mundane: mutual resentment and antagonisms, selfishness and hypocrisy in international politics. In short, sin that exists in our hearts. In 1934, in Berlin, the German-Polish Declaration of Non-Aggression was signed. When Poland made a mutual guarantee agreement with the UK, Hitler assumed that by doing so, the 1934 Declaration of Non-Aggression was violated and started creating a plan to attack our country. Because of Hitler's ill will, the German-Polish Declaration of Non-Aggression turned out to be nothing but a scrap of paper. Seeing the threat coming from the Third Reich, Stalin called for the creation of a collective security pact. In April 1939, discussions began in this matter. The Western side, which was unfriendly toward the USSR, was under a delusion that the Third Reich will direct the attack at the Soviet Republic, so it led the negotiations disdainfully. Its delegates were secondary and deprived of power. Poland refused to cooperate with the USSR. In such conditions, no agreement was established. For hypocrisy, selfishness, and antagonisms of the European countries, and the flawed policy of Józef Beck and President Mościcki, the Polish nation paid a very high price. Had the European powers showed more goodwill and willingness to help each other, and had Poland rejected its biases against the USSR, maybe the war wouldn't have happened. In 1920, the League of Nations was created. Its goal was to keep the world's peace. It turned out to be helpless and didn't prevent the Second World War. In 1945, the United Nations organization was founded. It also didn't prevent wars in many places on the globe. Why? As long as there is sin in human hearts, the governments are not able to guarantee peace and safety. It isn't God, but us who have to convert. Only then will there be peace and well-being in the world. That is why God allows different tragedies to happen. But this won't last forever. He shows that people are not able to guarantee peace and well-being in the world. It is therefore justifiable if God ended history and established the kingdom of heaven on earth. God implies that the best solution in this matter is the return of Jesus and the final end of the great battle between good and evil, and the restoration of the world. God created intelligent, perfect, and free beings. He showed them laws that guarantee well-being in life. Unfortunately, Lucifer, using his freedom wrongly for his own selfish goals, opposed God. His plan was simple: blame God for his unjust rule and unfairness of his demands. then take his place and convince everyone that without the limitations of God's laws, the world would be a better place. Lucifer's rebellion, which happened before the earth was created, was revealed to the prophets who wrote it down in the Holy Scripture. Let's look at the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, where the prophet wrote, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation, in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." What were Lucifer's motivations? To take God's place. Let's look at the prophecy written down in the book of Ezekiel. And there, chapter 28, where the prophet wrote, "Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have said thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness." The prophet Ezekiel wrote that Lucifer was God's finest creation and closest to God's throne. At one point, however, because of his pride, he entered the path that led to the opposition to God. Let's look at the last book of the New Testament, the book of Apocalypse. There, chapter 12, and let's read verses 7 through 9, and then 4. "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. And the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." Lucifer opposed God. He accused God of injustice and undermined the fairness of his laws. His suggestions are very convincing. The biblical text says that 1/3 of the angels seemed simply confused and stood by Lucifer's side. In verse 4, we read, "And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth." How come God didn't destroy Lucifer? Why did he allow him to act and bring so much unhappiness on us? Let's imagine that there was an opposition that accused the government and wanted to seize power. If the government used force and pressured the opposition to keep silent, this would probably convince the nation to support the opposition. The citizens would come to a conclusion that the opposition was right, and the government didn't know how to handle the situation, used force because they didn't have any arguments in their defense. This solution would get them into much bigger trouble than increase the number of their supporters. We've seen this in 1980s Poland in connection with the activities of Solidarność and political changes. Why God allowed Lucifer's rebellion to happen? By doing so, he proved that he is not a dictator, he is not a totalitarian ruler. He respects his creation's choices and cares about their opinions. God gave Lucifer time to prove his point. The heavenly beings have never seen anything like this before. They didn't know evil. Lucifer's attitude and accusations against God confused them so much that, as we've read, 1/3 of them supported him. God, respecting the principle of freedom, allowed Lucifer to act. Only God could prove that Lucifer was not right, and his accusations were wrong. The universe, observing Lucifer's actions, would shortly learn what evil was. Because Satan gained advantage over the earthlings, the earth became the place of the battle between good and evil. The earth is a school of the universe. What happens on earth shows what the world would look like without God's laws. To what leads the rejection of the Decalogue? What happens when we use our freedoms incorrectly? The universe is observing the conflict between good and evil that is happening on earth. In the letter to the Ephesians, and to be precise in chapter 3, we have a very interesting description that I'd like to read. Letter to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. And to make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world hath been hid in God, who created all things by Jesus Christ, to the intent that now unto the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be known by the church the manifold wisdom of God. The universe is watching what is happening on earth and is drawing conclusions. The highlight of this teaching about good and evil that the universe is going through in the school called Earth was the death of the Son of God. For this lesson, the universe had to wait 4,000 years. I would like to read chapter 12, verses 31 through 33, from the Gospel according to St. John, in which we read the following words spoken by Jesus Christ. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. This he said, signifying what death he should die. The life of Jesus showed his holiness. Nobody had any questions about it. Even the opposition that crucified him knew that. Even demons declared that he is the Son of God and paid him homage when they saw him doing good things. When Jewish leaders, inspired by Satan, crucified Jesus, the universe finally understood what he really wanted. The death of Christ proved God's innocence. The crucifixion of Jesus exposed Satan and revealed his true colors. Just like Jesus said, his crucifixion was the elevation of God's love and Satan's demise. The death of Christ drew toward God all sincere extraterrestrial creatures and people longing for a better world. So, if by the crucifixion of Jesus, God proved to be just, and Satan exposed his vileness, why God didn't end the history of evil on earth in that very moment? It seems that the reasons for God's decision are justified. Let's read some records. The first one can be found in the first epistle to Timothy, chapter 2, verse 4. Who will have all men to be saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. God wants to have all men saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. Let's look at the second record in the second epistle of Peter, chapter 3, verse 9. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. For you see, the above records tell us that God loves humanity and wants as many people as possible to be saved. He gives everyone a chance. Therefore, he tarries with ending history so that you and I and many others had a chance to come to their senses. Second of all, God allows the further existence of sin so that evil could fully evolve. When the heavenly beings pay close attention to the evil on earth, they come to their senses and see for themselves that without divine intervention, this nightmare will never end. God will end history when evil matures, and the universe sees for itself that divine intervention is necessary. The return of Jesus must be an act of God's mercy, ending the nightmare of a thousands-year-old sin, and not a verdict of a totalitarian tyrant and dictator who doesn't care about other people's opinions. God allowed the atrocities that took place in Auschwitz-Birkenau to happen, so that all logically thinking creations could see what evil is and conclude that God has to end the history of mankind as quickly as possible.